Good morning and welcome to the Point. This has been spring break for many of you, taking a few days off to spend time with the family. State legislature in the same circumstance. They'll be heading back to Lansing next week. In the meantime, we sat down with the Speaker of the House, Jase Bolger, to talk about what's going on in that legislative body and what he expects when they return. Mr. Speaker, I want to start where we left off, and you may not remember this, but when you left here last time, you sent me a very long text email talking about the conversation we had just had. And that conversation, to refresh your memory, was very much me saying, look, when you came to the House of Representatives, you were a fresh-faced kid and you came in and you were all excited and you were going to change the world and there was going to be bipartisanship. And I said, while there may have been efforts, I thought things in the legislature were still pretty partisan and that there was a lot of disagreement. We talked about that for a while and moved on. But after you had thought about it for a while, you disagreed with my premise. You said, look, we've done this, and this. We've done it in a bipartisan way. We have reached across the aisle. Yes, there are differences that go along party lines, but from your perspective, and I'm not divulging all of this personal communication, this was kind of the paraphrasing, that you thought that I had not given you and or your colleagues the credit for that. So the reason I start there today is not to rehash an old argument, but to give you a bit of a rebuttal, because in the past few weeks, the personal property tax has been repealed for businesses in the state. Something that has been talked about since I have been covering the legislature, well before you were there. And it was done in a bipartisan fashion. In fact, you appeared at an event with Senator Rebecca Warren from Ann Arbor, no conservative is she.
Proudly liberal, as she will tell you.
And Senator Mark Jansen, no liberal is he. And they agreed on this issue. So to that degree, and to your point, there are some big things that have happened because of bipartisanship. So I'll give that as a partial apology.
Well, and without meaning to offend, mass compromise breaks out in legislature doesn't create an interesting headline.
That's right.
And so,
although maybe it should.
So we do see that the media coverage and what most people talk about are those times that we disagree. They cover our debate.
Right.
And I would categorize those as debates and not arguments. And that's important, that we listen to each other even when we do argue. But you're right. We have been able to solve problems, and that's what this is about, is solving problems and the problems that have been around. Not worrying about casting blame, not worrying about pointing fingers. Many of the things that we're dealing with have been around long before we got here. And the PPT, personal property tax, first of all, is misnamed. Second of all, it was damaging, and very importantly, it was essential. And so if we walk through that, the reason I say it's misnamed, the personal property tax is actually a business equipment tax. It would be akin to if at home you paid sales tax when you bought a television or a couch. And then every year you got a bill to pay tax again on that television and couch. Well, that's what the PPT does to an employer. When they bring in a big piece of equipment and they've purchased that to provide jobs and make their product, they're handed not a thank you note, but a tax bill in Michigan. And that was making us uncompetitive to attract those investments that create those jobs and provide those career opportunities for our workers. So we needed to repeal that. And as you say, that had been talked about for a long time. However, the revenue that it generated was essential to our schools, to our local governments who provide through that revenue, police and fire and what they can for roads. And so we had to make sure that we answered the question of what would happen to them. And so what we've done with the PPT repeal is take away that onerous tax. Make sure that we are more competitive and can attract that investment. However, provide the ongoing resources needed to our schools and to our local governments. And that's why at the bill signing you saw schools, local governments, employers, Republicans and Democrats coming together to celebrate a solution to make Michigan a better place to provide a job.
It is an interesting concept because the money you talked about is essential. In fact, one of the local school superintendents talked about just how much money it raises for their school, law enforcement, and all of those kind of things. And so part of the whole conversation was how to replace that money. And you found a dedicated stream of money with which to do that. And so you were able to kind of check off all of the boxes. But when you talk about the tax on that piece of equipment, it could be a few $100,000, it could be several millions of dollars. Tax on that equipment becomes pretty expensive. But one of the important things is that we're one of the few states in our geographic area that has this. You made the point that folks in Indiana may be less than excited about this.
Well, I talked to a legislator from Indiana who we had talked a couple of years in to our obligation to govern, and they had said, listen, we're watching what's happening in Michigan. We're watching what you're doing with the repeal of the MBT. We saw what you did with right to work. But we're really get nervous when you do something with your PPT. We think we're still competitive and have an advantage over you because of the penalizing PPT. And so what I said was, listen, today we make Indiana scared. And any day you make Indiana scared is a day that Michigan workers can celebrate because their outlook is brighter. Their future is better when we are competing and winning that competition with Indiana.
One of the things that we suffered through in this state over the period of time, the last 10 years, and you can go back a little further, at the end of the Engler administration, the economy started to cool off in a very dramatic way. And when that happens, it's not just the individuals, which of course are the most important, who start to suffer, but state government was really misaligned. There were structural deficits. The money that had been coming in was no longer coming in. Give me your take on things like changing the Michigan business tax, on things like this personal property tax, and by the way, raising taxes on pensions and some of those things. Where is this state as you prepare to leave office in a few months? Where is it financially in terms of solvency and the ability to meet the needs of the people that it is supposed to serve?
Well, if you talk about where we were, where we are, and where we were headed, where we were when I first ran for office, I believed was in a downward spiral. And that state government was not balancing its budget. It just had seen government shutdown. It had escalating debt. It was seeing an economy that was faltering, and the solution was to raise more taxes and to seek to grow a bigger piece of a shrinking pie. And I thought that was wrong. I thought if you want to make state government's checkbook get healthier, the first thing you need to do is make our families' checkbooks get healthier. And so we had to embark upon a restructuring, and that is structurally balance the budget, make sure we put more money into our savings account, pay down our debts, and make sure that Michigan's economy, our environment, became better to provide jobs. What we're seeing today is a budget that's balanced not only on time every year, but early. We're seeing a budget that's balanced and creating surpluses and providing surpluses. We're seeing our savings account that have gone from $2 million to about $600 million in it, and we're seeing debt reduced by about $21 billion. Our fiscal house is in order, but most exciting to me is we've seen over 250,000 jobs come back to Michigan. When I really get excited, I hear about college kids that are returning to Michigan. I hear grandparents talk about their children and their grandchildren now returning to Michigan and seeing Michigan as that state people move to instead of flee from.
We'll be back with more of our conversation with the Speaker of the House, Jase Bolger, when we return to The Point. Welcome back to The Point. As I pointed out, it has been spring break week for many of you, and as many of you now prepare to head back to school and work, so will the state legislature as they return for at least a partial session sometime later this week. In the meantime, we sat down to talk with the Speaker of the House, Jase Bolger, about what he expects in the remaining months of his tenure as Speaker and what he'd like to see get done in Lansing. When you look at what's happening in this state and when you go back to your district, and you wear several hats. You are the leader of the Republican Party. You're the Speaker of the entire House. You are one of those four folks in the legislature that get together and try to hammer out things with the administration very often. But you're still a member of the House of Representatives, and you have constituents that you go back and talk to. What do they tell you when you go back to Marshall or other places? What do they tell you about schools in our state? Not higher education, but K through 12 schools. What do they tell you about funding? Because that is going to be one of the fundamental arguments in this upcoming election, is how schools are funded and whose numbers you choose to believe.
Well, I think it's not debatable that more money is going into K-12 education today. Now, people can argue and parse their words over where that money goes within the K-12 system, but more money is going to K-12 today, and the biggest thing they parse is they don't want to count money that's used to pay down or pay for the teacher pension obligation. That is money that would otherwise be a burden on our school districts. What I hear loud and clear, though, is what our parents want is they want an opportunity for their kids. They want their kids to have the opportunity to learn in school to then be successful in their life and their career. What I hear is that things are getting better, that we had to make very difficult but necessary decisions 3 years ago. But we said at the time, the point was to press the reset button, to put our state's house in fiscal order, to set our state's path on a brighter future or for future success. And what we're seeing is that our budgets are getting better now. We're seeing that because our families' home budgets are getting better. And so we're seeing that improvement, and we're seeing this year we get to debate how much of an increase that we will be able to share with our schools. And so people do understand that difficult decisions need to be made, but many people don't forget that what happened on the prior administration was annual budget cuts in mid-year and annual scrambling to balance the budget because it hadn't been done properly the first time, and that meant mid-year cuts and significant pain to our schools. And so while we face that reality, while we made the difficult but necessary decisions, I'm hearing many people who are worried about where we've been but are very hopeful about where we're headed.
Two more quick school questions. In 60 seconds or less, explain what EAA is and where are we with that?
EAA is the Economic Achievement Authority, and what that is our schools that were failing, perennially in the bottom 5%, and these are in Detroit. Now there's a bill, the State Reform District, that offers parameters around what we do with our schools who do fail on a regular basis, and we're talking about the lowest 5% performing schools in the state. And when I talk to parents who say they want an opportunity for their kids, they want that opportunity for all kids in the state of Michigan. So there's been much political opposition, and people do misname and miscall the state reform bill the EAA bill. They've tried to mix the two, but they are different issues. And what they quite often do is they ignore that we have a bill, or they have a statute on the books already, and that is a bill that was passed in 2009 at the urging of President Obama, signed by Governor Granholm, that allows for a state takeover of failing districts. What we're doing with the bill that I think you're referencing is to provide parameters and provide our local intermediate school districts the opportunity and the control, the local control, to be able to shape that school's future. What we want to do is we want to get that school building turned around. We're not talking about entire districts. We're talking about specific buildings that don't perform. And so to get that building turned around so that those kids have an opportunity for a successful future, and get that school building turned back over to the school district. And so much of the opposition, if you actually listen to it, if you pull it apart, they're opposed to the statute that's in place already, not the bill that's before us.
I have been unsuccessful in getting you to tell me what the future holds for you after you leave office, but let me ask this. Assuming that you will not be in office past January of this coming year, is Common Core something that you believe the legislature, future legislatures, are going to have to deal with in a more pointed fashion? Because as an observer, and this is only anecdotal, but as an observer, Common Core started kind of quietly, its opponents would say insidiously, and has been adopted across the nation. But now some people are taking a second look and saying, wait a minute, we're not sure about these standards or about these regulations, about the way that this is going to be implemented. Is that going to be an issue in Michigan, or is Common Core here and here to stay?
I'll tell you exactly what I'm going to do after this year, and that is enjoy a second honeymoon. My wife and I will be empty nesters, new empty nesters, as our youngest daughter, Megan, our only daughter, but our youngest child, Megan, goes to Grand Valley. So in the fall, we will have an empty household, just the two of us. And I say that to say that we've got two great kids. One's a sophomore in college. Our daughter, Megan, as I say, is a senior now at Marshall High School. And so I've watched their education. I believe our public schools have done a great job. I am grateful for Marshall's teachers and the great job they've done with our kids. The whole conversation behind education is, how do we make sure that all of our kids have opportunities? How do we have high expectation and then make sure that we measure results and that we have accountability? And so the Common Core was actually proposed by governors across the state. It has been mischaracterized as some sort of a federal takeover, but this was state-driven. This is something that the states got together and said, we're competing not just nationally, we're competing internationally. And we hear all sorts of reports about other countries. It's time that American kids had a common expectation And then we leave it to our local school districts, leave it to our states to innovate and go beyond that and exceed that. And so what this does is it seeks to have that expectation. Then we seek to measure those results, and then we look to our schools to achieve and to exceed those expectations. But it will be something, no doubt, that's debated. And when you talk about education, you're talking about people's kids. When you talk about people's kids, they rightfully get very passionate. And so I expect all of the education debate will continue to be very passionate.
Will there be a debate about overall funding mechanism for schools, do you think, in the state?
There may be. There may be. We will see. Really, people are already forgetting the purpose of Proposal A, and that was to close the gap in that disparity between the lowest funded students and our highest funded students.
Try to equalize.
Try to equalize that and make sure that all kids have that equal opportunity. That gap has been narrowed significantly. Now it's not all the way closed, so people still point to that. But I think that as long as there are schools around, people are going to debate very passionately about their kids in their schools and how they're funded.
We talked a little bit ago about the budget process and how it has changed over the past several years. And in an upcoming show, Chairman of House Appropriations is going to be here to talk about exactly where we are during this brief break that you're taking. But give me your take where you are in terms of putting a spending program together, because if this is like years past, and I mean recent years past, given that this is an election year, I expect this thing to be done by the end of May, the first part of June, because there are a lot of hands to shake and a lot of babies to kiss for a lot of those guys that are running for, and women that are running for re-election or for election. So where are we as this Easter break comes up?
No, that's not entirely fair, Rick, because we've had the budget done
That's true.
in late May, early June for 3 years in a row now, and you were held hostage late nights in the Capitol building wondering, was the budget going to be balanced, and watching the state shut down. So we've made progress, and I'll tell you, it brings a smile to my face to hear you say we expect the budget to be done in late May or early June, because it wasn't that long ago people scoffed at that idea.
No, people
they
didn't scoff, they laughed, because when this governor came in and said, we're going to get this done, I remember one leader saying, well, that's a suggestion. That's not a hard and fast date. But the fact is that it did get done. And just for people who may not remember or perhaps are new to the hostage reference, that back in 2007 particularly, the legislature could not come to a budget agreement. And the House was at the call of the chair for hours upon end. I could leave, but you couldn't.
Well, I wasn't there.
Yeah, right.
So
but members couldn't. But this went on and on and on all through the month of September, a brief reprieve, and then all through the month of October, which was an extension that had some dubious constitutional bearing. But nonetheless, the budget has gotten considerably, I won't say easier, but it has been done in a more streamlined manner.
It has been, but more important than the timeline has been the content. And if you look at headlines from 4 short years ago, and when I first got to office, the questions were, if I were on your show, the question was, how are you going to solve this $1.5 billion deficit? Sometimes it climbed over that. And I'm glad that right now we get to talk about how are we going to get the budget done, not on time, but early, and how we're going to deal with an almost $1 billion surplus. So that's where we're today. And where I expect us to be is to continue to grow our savings account, continue to pay down debt, and continue to increase our investments in key areas. And that does include roads, that does include our K-12, our education system, and that does include public safety. We've increased the number of state troopers in the state. We've made sure that we're focusing our dollars the same way a family would, and that's by placing priorities and making sure that we fund our priorities as best we can.
I've made a couple of references to it, and you talked about it a little bit. You are coming to the end of your 6 years. Term limits say that you cannot run to serve in the House again. I haven't seen your name on any Secretary of State's website, so I make the assumption that at least in short term there's nothing else for you. And I'm not going to go down that road again because I have seen the roadblocks that have been set up. But let's talk about this. What are you going to do for the next 6, 7, 8 months between now and the time that your current term is up? Because there are a lot of things out there. We talked about in an earlier show, we talked a little bit about the roads issue, but there are some other big items I suspect that you would like to check off the list before you hand over the keys to the Speaker's office?
There are other problems that I would like to solve, and that's what this is about. And so I won't let up. I expect to drive all the way hard through the end, and that is to continue to do things like balance the budget, to look to bring Detroit out of bankruptcy, to solve roads, to make sure that we are improving our roads, and to make sure that we are solving auto insurance and the escalating cost for our ratepayers and the people across Michigan who work hard every day and then can't afford their auto insurance. And so none of those are going to be easy. None of those are going to be quick. All of those are long-term things that have been around not only for decades, but in some cases generations. But those are things I will continue to work on and see what we can do to provide a solution.
We've got a couple of minutes left, and again, I don't want to get too far in the weeds on this because I know that the conversation is ongoing, but the MCCA and the no-fault insurance process in the state has come under a lot of scrutiny, and particular scrutiny in the last 3 years. There's been a lot of conversation about it. But there's also a great deal of disagreement. And one of the things it has done is provided full employment for every lobbyist in Lansing because everybody's lined up with somebody. Where do you try to go with this? On one hand, people say, well, this is the most liberal payout in the country. No other state has this unlimited benefit that Michigan has. On the other hand, people will say we're only paying $180 some odd for this very generous, catastrophic care fund that no other state has. Where does that conversation go?
Well, part of that is their conversation about $186, the MCCA. That is only claims over $500,000, and so they're not addressing all the claims that you pay that are under $500,000. The average claim is actually less than $50,000. But what we need to do, the bottom line is Michigan has the best coverage in the country, but it has increasingly unaffordable coverage. So we need to maintain the best coverage in the country, but make it more affordable. Now, how do you do that? Simply put, you make it more efficient. And we have an inefficient auto insurance that is a medical provider, medical payer. And what we have today is we have you, if you're injured, at work or at home or in your automobile, they're all paid very differently. But far and away, what's paid the most, what's paid the highest, is the same service is paid so much more if you're injured in your auto. Now, I talked to one hospital, for example, and they talked about $7 million in claims that they receive every year from auto insurance. But they say they have to spend $1 million to get paid, and usually over a year to fight to get paid. Now, you know, if they're spending $1 million, there's lawyers on the insurance company side spending $1 million. So who pays for that? Everybody who pays for the auto insurance. They're spending $8 million to get $6 million in benefits. That's what I'm seeking to attack, to make sure that they continue to get their benefits, but that we take that waste out. Without a doubt, the people who benefit from that system today, they're not happy about it, and they're fighting it. So I expect them to continue to fight it, but I hope we can find solutions.
Does the Affordable Care Act factor into that at all? I mean, the fact that under the new federal system, including the expansion of Medicaid, which we did not get to here, but does that factor into the ability to take a fresh look at no fault, or will those claims still be paid out of an auto fund?
Those claims would still be paid from the auto fund, and you could argue that do we even need that coverage because everybody has guaranteed coverage, but we're not addressing that. We are not stopping that coverage. Instead, we're going in with the approach that we want to maintain the best coverage in the country. People rightfully get defensive, and they want to keep the coverage that they have. I don't want anybody to lose their coverage. Instead, I simply want to make it more efficient. And I want people who are paying for their auto insurance to pay a similar price that they do if they're injured at work or they do if they're injured at home.
Mr. Speaker, there's much more to talk about. You've been a frequent guest, and we hope to get at least one more visit from you before you get out of office. Thank you for being here, and we're back with more To the Point just a moment. When the legislature heads back to work, job one will be getting the budget done. Next week, we'll talk with the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, Representative Joe Havman, about that process. Also next week, we'll hear from Fred Upton, congressman who is investigating the General Motors recall. That and more when you join us next week. To the Point.